There are a few moments in the long histories of cultures when there can clearly be identified some explosions of knowledge, some great technological innovations, some items that are discovered or put forward by thinkers, by creative geniuses that move the civilization forward greatly within a decade, within 30 years. These have been identified through time, and one of such those has been dubbed in the history of Western culture the Renaissance, or the period of rebirth. That happened in Florence, Italy, in the 15th and early 16th century. There was a magic period of 30 years, and that uh, valley of Florence, Italy, where there are some great geniuses and technological innovations in the areas of art and perspective that truly made Western culture jump forward by leaps and bounds. One such moment of explosion of knowledge clearly happened in Athens, Greece, in the 5th century before Christ. The peak of the development of the Greeks through their long period of time of ancient culture in ancient culture is now dubbed the classical age. It's called classical because it still is viewed as one of the great moments of advancement in Western civilization, and it can be pinpointed in one city in one particular century. In fact, it can be really pinpointed to even a shorter period of time than the whole century, a century and a half, even though the effects will be felt and further developments will happen even in the century afterwards. The classical age now refers to the 5th and most of the 4th century, but it is really the 5th century, and specifically in Athens, when truly we have some remarkable developments. I'm going to use the slide here now and spend several minutes on it to kind of walk through the history of the 5th century in Athens, Greece. Not that other Greek city-states don't matter. In fact, they will intersect with what's happening in Athens, but Athens truly is the place, and it's in the 5th century when truly we have this great advancements in various areas of the human condition in Western civilization. The years that you see at the top for the classical Greek age are 500 to 323 before Christ, so about 175 years. But really, we're looking at the 100 years that go from about 400 to from about 500 to about 400 in this quick survey that we're making right now. And I've divided the century, the 5th century BC, into three slices of a pie. And these are according to a theory put forward by cultural historians where things happen in a civilization in a certain pattern. And sometimes you can clearly identify it, a pattern being there's a period of adjustment, a period of balance, and a period of chaos, 1, 2, and 3. And it seems like that these three phases of a development of a civilization have happened more than once. And that's why it seems to be useful. I'm applying it here to Athens of the 5th century. And let me start with the first period, the first 40 or so years from about 500 to about 460. First of all, there is a war. In around 490, the big Persian Empire that we have referred to in a previous study comes spilling across the sea and comes with massive armies, some say even up to 200,000, armies to the size of which no one had ever seen. And truly, there was an expectation that the Greek city-states, even as warlike as some of them were, like Sparta, there's no way that they could stop the invasion of the Persians, the Asians, that happened beginning with the year 490. Surprisingly, the Greek city-states will unite against this big, huge, giant Goliath outside enemy that's threatening their very existence. The Battle of Marathon in 490 as a surprise victory for the Greek city-states. The plain of Marathon is just 26 miles from Athens, Greece, and it is a surprise victory victory, and one that catches both off guard, the Greeks and the Persians, but is just a blip in the screen. It's just one Saturday's game, and the next Saturday, clearly the Persians are going to be back and win the rest of the season, so to speak. Using a sports metaphor. And victories there are on the part of the Persians. They will get to Athens. They will destroy all the temples that are on top of the Acropolis in Athens. But at the end of the 11-year conflict between the Greek city-states, and that means Athens, Sparta, Thebes, Corinth, and all the rest of them, united against this outside enemy, the moral of the story is the Greeks repel the Persians. The Persians leave, never to come back again, because their losses are great, and the surprising ability of the Greeks to use tactics and maneuverings and naval battles, land battles, truly catches the Persians off guard. The Greeks are proud. The aftermath of the Persian Wars, the 11 years between 490 and 479, leave all of the Greeks feeling proud to be a Greek, because they, and they alone, have stopped the Persian enemy. One of those that fought in the Battle of Marathon was a great tragedian, a creative writer of Athens who goes by the name of Aeschylus, and he wrote a series of tragedies. Tragedies usually were written in threes, in trilogies, and he wrote some and won several first prizes. Theater is a very important production of the Greek culture. It is, you could say, the ancestor of our movies or Netflix or series. Before there was film, there was theater, and on theater you put characters and stories that represent your values, your ideas, and this is what the Greeks did, and they get credit for establishing early on the theater as an important mirror of their culture, where they put on display their ideas. One of the great plays of Aeschylus will be one called Agamemnon, which is, of course, named after the great Greek king that many centuries before had led the Mycenaean Greek warriors against Troy and defeated them. But in this play and in the trilogy that follows, the other two plays past the one called Agamemnon, Aeschylus celebrates the development in Athens, not just of they kept their freedom in spite of the outside enemy. On his grave, he had inscribed, "I fought at Marathon," but in his play, he celebrates the development of a better system of justice. So the period of adjustment of Athens, Greece, the first 40 years of the 5th century before Christ, see not only the defeat, military defeat of an outside enemy, so they keep their freedom, their independence, but also Athens proceeds to examine the question of what does justice mean? What does it mean? How do you achieve it? And the development of the jury system, jury of your peers, 12 jurors that are chosen, is one of the great developments of this first few decades, and it happens in Athens, Greece. To this day, we haven't come up with a better system. We use the jury of our peers, which was developed in Athens, Greece at the beginning of the 5th century to decide major cases. But beyond that, in the area not just of justice, but of politics, it is Athens, Greece, that after having had kings in the centuries before and then experimented with the governing of a few, oligarchy, and then tried out tyrants, tyranny, they settle on a new form of doing politics, of governing themselves, which is democracy, which of course is defined by the governing of the people. The reminder again that by people they mean the free male citizens of the city, which number 400, 500, something like that. But they have discussion, open air discussion from the free citizens of free male citizens of Athens. And this is a development that, again, to this day, is we haven't figured out a better way to do politics. The jury system for justice, democracy for politics, Athens, Greece, 5th century, this is where it happens. And that's why you could say this is a period of adjustment, because things are getting better and better in Athens, asking the right questions, coming up to better solutions to how to do justice and how to do politics. That, you could say, things are getting better and better, period of adjustment will lead to the grandest of times in ancient Greece. It's in Athens, and it's called the period of balance. It is nicknamed as well by cultural historians, I'm looking at number 2 now, as the golden age of Pericles. Pericles being the politician that supervised most of the 30 years that go from the year 460 to 430 BC, right in the middle of the century. There's a 30-year period, a magic period in which truly Athens becomes the center of the world for so many developments, not just in the jury system, but also democracy, but many other things. Now, Athens, to be fair, it becomes powerful and wealthy as well. So it's always easier to proclaim yourself the grandest, the best, the place everybody wants to move to when you are rich and famous both. The Athenian Empire, which I'll show you on the map that will follow this particular slide, they become fairly influential, not just in the area around their city, the city-state of Athens, but also all along the colonies of what we call Asia Minor back then, or Turkish coast today, islands, and various other areas. Athens' influence and its empire extends significantly, and thus money starts pouring in, not only from silver mines, but also from contributions of various other city-states that want to fall within the spectrum of the Athenian Empire. And thus, there is plenty of money. And thus they begin building their temples to their gods on their Acropolis. Again, a place in Athens, like in all other Greek cities, a high point in Athens where they build their temples. And there are 3 that I'm going to show you with images. Of course, the famous Parthenon, the temple to Athena, the goddess that gives them their name, Athens, because they choose Athena as their major goddess. But then also the temple called Erechtheion, which is the temple to the second most important god of the Athenians, which is the god of the sea, Poseidon. And then the goddess of victory, her name is Nike. I'm going to show you all 3 of these on the Acropolis. The politician that begins the impetus to building the Parthenon and the Erechtheion and the Nike temple is Pericles. And Pericles is truly significant, gives his name to these magic 30 years of the highest peak of Greek development in Athens. And in a funeral oration, that is a speech given in honor of a fallen Athenian soldier, he truly goes on to boast significantly about Athens. And this funeral oration is both true and dangerous, because any culture and any time that recognizes that it's truly a grand, if not the best place on earth where things are happening, but it also boasts about them. There is something peculiar about boasting from a human perspective, whether it's an individual or it's a whole society or culture. The moment that you I start boasting about it, it seems like something always happens to bring the culture, the person down a notch, which is what happens to Athenian culture. Please note that in this three-step process, adjustment, balance, there's a number 3 called chaos. Things are going to fall apart. And there's no way that Pericles could foresee that from where he was at when he gave that funeral oration, when he was bragging about everybody wanting to move to Athens, and that people of the future would be saying that Athens of the 5th century was the best place to be, which is, of course, what I've just spent 10 minutes doing. Athens of the 5th century was the best place to be until things started falling apart. And the question is, how can you avoid falling apart? It's like climbing a mountain, reaching the peak, and then falling off the edge of the mountain. Do you have to fall off the edge of the mountain? Can't you stay on the peak? Can't you stay in a period of balance? Can't you stay in a great time when great innovations, ideas, creative geniuses flourish? One of the creative geniuses of the Athens of the 5th century was a tragedy writer, a greatest, maybe the greatest, by the name of Sophocles. One of the plays that he will write will be called by Aristotle later on the greatest tragedy ever written. The story is Oedipus, a king. Oedipus Rex means a King Oedipus. And in another setting, maybe we can, you'll be able to study the basic narrative of Oedipus, the story of Oedipus. Again, kind of like we saw with Homer, all the Greeks knew the story of Oedipus, but it's how you tell it and how Sophocles tells it and puts it on stage in Athens in the year 429 that really matters. When he put on that play, the end of the play has the main character that finds out he's made a big mistake. That would be Oedipus. And he blinds himself and walks off the stage, and the curtains close, and basically the audience is left to wonder, okay, now what are we supposed to do? Sophocles, as he tells the story of Oedipus, a great king, a good, noble figure that tries to do what's right and well, but ends up committing some atrocious mistakes. Sophocles seems to say, well, what if we're really great, but there's something about us, human beings, that makes us commit gigantic mistakes. The gigantic mistakes are going to happen right after this play got first place in Athens, Greece, in year 429. There are some natural disasters like a plague, but then there is a war that starts. So please notice that Thucydides, he's our historian, he writes the tragic history of a second war in the 5th century that relates to not only Athens, but Greek city-states in general. The history of the Peloponnesian Wars is an account, a sad account, a detailed account of the second major war in the 5th century. This war is not against an outside enemy that tries to gobble up all the Greek city-states. This war is brother against brother. It's a civil war. It's the war between Athens and the other great city of the Greeks that went in a very different direction. That would be Sparta. The Peloponnesian War is from 429 all the way to 407. It's a 23-year war in which the Greeks shot themselves on foot. Sparta and Athens went at it, doing more damage than the Persians had ever done. And it was a case where one of the two is going to win. I might be rooting for Athens, but it is not going to be Athens to win. It's going to be Sparta. And Thucydides tells a story of how the great Athenian Empire and great city of Athens, with all of its developments, fell under the domain of the permanent military boot camp called Sparta, and that is the period of chaos. The last 30 years of the 5th century, from 429 to 400 or 399, are the story of the tragic Peloponnesian War, which ends in 404 with Athens losing to Sparta. And then there are all kinds of critics that rise to tell the story of what had happened, how the Greeks had achieved great things and then absolutely shot themselves in the foot. There are several critics of Athens. Euripides is one. He again writes tragedies. He writes several tragedies. They're all very grotesquely violent. And let me go ahead and say this. In theater up to Euripides, the Greeks preferred not to put violence on stage. They narrated it. They told about an assassination, a killing, a tragedy. They didn't have to put it on stage. They didn't have to show it, see it. But Euripides is the first one to try to shock the Athenian audiences with his tragedies. Like, for example, Medea, the story of a mother who goes crazy over the worship of Dionysus and ends up beheading her own son and putting his head on a stick and parading around town. That's absolutely grotesque. Euripides is trying to shock his own Athenian fellow citizens into welcome to our city now, where we have lost our heads, kind of like Medea lost hers and her son did too. Tragedy is one form of theater. It's where things end up complicated and start out complicated and end up with somebody blind, somebody dead, or a lot of people dead. Tragedy ends with, well, it's a tragedy. And you're supposed to learn from the outcome of the tragedy, learn what not to do. That's tragedy. Comedy is things starts complicated, but in the end there's a Disney ending, and there's laughter, and it's lighter, and everything is okay by the end. The Greeks thought that tragedy was the better type of theater because it was more like real life, while comedy was, well, it could teach you some lessons, but it was superficial, not quite as deep. Aristophanes is a comedy writer of Athens. He is a critic of Athens too, and he writes comedies that are highly critical of Athens and the direction it has taken. Lysistrata is one of the comedies that clearly does that, written by Aristophanes. Socrates is the last name on your list here. Well, last before I talk about some developments in the 4th century. Socrates was a military man. He had fought in the Peloponnesian War, but he was a teacher. And he was a philosopher. And he was a teacher in Athens who, in his later stages of his life, was highly critical of the Athenians and the choices they had made that brought them down. And he was teaching the young people of Athens, and he was put on trial in the year 399 by the Athenians because they were tired of him putting ideas in the heads of their young people critical of their parents. And so Socrates was truly put on trial for his ideas and ultimately was condemned to death. And he took the hemlock of poison and died in 399. This is not a staged story, it's for real. One of the greatest thinkers of all times, Socrates, will die as an effect of the Athenians not able to handle criticism of their own direction. The last three names I've talked about, Euripides, Aristophanes, Socrates, tragedy writer, comedy writer, and a philosopher, are all critics of Athens in that final stage of the 5th century. That's not to say that Athens will not produce some great thinkers and developments even into the 4th century. So the classical Greek age does spill into the year 323, and I'll tell you later why that date is important. But I want to highlight before I finish with this slide and move on to some images that in Athens, Greece, the number one disciple of Socrates as he dies in 399 is Plato. He's not the only one, but he's the most famous. He will go on to found a famous school of philosophy, Platonic school called the Academy in Athens, Greece. And the most famous student of Plato will be the philosopher Aristotle, and he will go on to found his own school called the Lyceum. So there will continue to be some great developments in Athens, Greece, in the 4th century. However, the peak, the greatest of times, a golden age in Athens between 460 and 430 has been lost for good. Now, to finish up on this quick look at the classical age of Greece, there is the map that I told you about at its peak. Look at, please, in the middle, there's Attica, the city-state of Athens, the city and its lands around it. But then look at all the yellow areas, which are the areas where the Athenian Empire expanded to have influence on, and thus this gave Athens a big head because they thought that they would last forever and would be the center of the earth, the belly button of the earth. In fact, that is exactly a, a Greek concept, that the center of the earth is Athens. They thought that it would last forever. Now, Pericles, during the Golden Age, used some money from the league that he had developed and from a silver mine, and constructed what's called, well, one of the greatest structures of all time. Not in size, the pyramids are much larger, of course, but in engineering skills. Now, today you see it in ruins because there was an explosion in the 17th century. It became an ammunition dump for the Ottoman Turks, and a shell from a Venetian ship in the harbor hit it, and thus archaeologists today are simply trying to put the pieces back together of what was the temple to the goddess Athena that stood on the Acropolis in Athens. Truly a splendid place. It is a structure that to this day is studied because, for example, there are so many engineering tricks. The Greeks already knew about optical illusions. So, for example, all of the columns you're looking at, they look like they're thicker at the bottom and thinner at the top, but they actually bulge in the middle. But because of the way in which we look at it, our optical perspective changes things. There are no straight lines really in this thing. For example, all of those columns lean in a bit, and they all converge. If you drew a line from all these columns up to the heavens, they all converge about 1.5 miles up in the air into a single point, which is another of the many remarkable engineering skills of the two major sculptors, engineers, Kallikrates and Kthinos. This is what a typical Greek temple looks like in the flat surface. It has 3 steps, so they're all going to be this way from now on. And then it has, of course, a central Holy of Holies where the statue of the goddess was. Remind you that you don't go into a temple, pagan temple. There's the entrance is to the east, and only the priests bring in the offerings to the goddess. But you can glance the statue. Some say it was 40 foot high, gilded, covered in gold and ivory, of the goddess Athena at the center of the Parthenon. Here's another view of the Parthenon in its state today. They're again piecing it back together little by little over the years, but one of the most remarkable structures ever built. Expensive, all built with Pentelian white marble that was quarried from mountains 20 miles away. The best of sculptors, builders, was brought together for an 11-year stretch and constructed this masterpiece, a symbol of the achievements of the Athenian culture. So not only did they develop the jury system, democracy, but also were some of the greatest engineers of all times. This is a quick artistic reconstruction of what the Acropolis in Athens looked like. So you see the massive statue of Athena standing there, then the Acropolis to the right, and then the Propylaeon, the entrance. So snaking up into the Acropolis, you would see priestesses and other people bringing offerings. There are 3 major temples besides the one of the Parthenon to Athena. There's also the temple called the Erechtheion, which is the temple to the god of the sea. Of course, the Athenians' harbor is just 5 miles away from this, and they are very much seagoing people. The Greeks all are, even those that are from cities like Athens that are on the mainland, but the Greeks are going to be sailors for all of their lives. This is the temple to the god Poseidon, and one of the most famous aspects of it is the Porch of the Maidens. Very much a representation of classical architecture. These maidens look like they're walking in a procession. They should have a headache from the kind of the weight that they're carrying on their head, but they can stand there forever, no emotions, balanced, symmetrical, just absolutely a perfect representation of how the Greeks felt about themselves. We are the best in the world. This is the place. We are achieving great things. A confidence that is expressed in their statuary, such as you see here, and I'll show you examples of that. This is the third temple on the Acropolis in Athens, the temple to the goddess of victory, Nike. She is a winged goddess, but the Athenians will clip off her wings, hoping that she will stay with them forever. She won't, because the Spartans will defeat Athens in 404, and beyond that, a few decades later, there will come a Greek Macedonian king from the north called Alexander the Great, who will govern and dominate all of Greece for a long time. Here are some other images of statuary from the classical period. This is the statue of Athena, or a copy of it, with her headset and Nike in her hand. Sometimes she has an owl in her hand, which is a symbol of wisdom. Athena is the goddess of wisdom, but she's also the goddess of war. Please see a shield. There is a god of war as well, but she is also a goddess of war. That is one of many attributes of the goddess Athena, the goddess of reason, rationality, thinking, wisdom, but also war, the goddess Athena. This is the theater, one of the oldest, if not the oldest, in Greek culture, except for the one we saw in the palace of the Minoans in Knossos. But this is where the plays of Aeschylus and Sophocles and Euripides were put on. And theater and tragedy and comedy become a major staple of Athenian Greek life, where they see the good and the bad, where tragedians try to put on ideas that will confront, that will make Athenians think, that will make Athenians celebrate, all of the above. It's not just an hour and a half time. I'll remind you that there's no orchestra pit. The musicians walk about with the actors who have masks on their faces, and so you know them by their mask, what character they are playing in plays. Very good acoustics. The Greeks will figure out how to let the cheap seats hear just fine what is being said by the actors and the musicians, what is being played by them, because they figure out how to use the natural acoustics of the landscape of a hill. Couple of last images, statuary of the classical Greek age. Here is a charioteer. He's called the Delphi charioteer. He is amazing, made out of bronze, which is a very hard. The Athenian Greeks of the classical age truly are remarkable in the skills that they have in casting bronze statues like this. What's missing is the chariot and the horses. So if you can imagine, this is a victorious charioteer. We know that he won because he has just finished the race. A belt around his waist has pulled his tunic up so it doesn't get caught in the spokes of the wheels. And then the look of confidence in his eyes as he stands there victorious, kind of like the Athenians felt during this classical period. We are the champions of the world. People will talk about us in the centuries to come, and of course we are. But of course we have to tell the rest of the story, which is how Athens fell apart. But this is the representation of balance and symmetry. Can stand here forever, no emotion, which is also the words that I associate with this bronze statue, again, of the classical Greek age. It's a statue of either the god Zeus or the god Poseidon. We're not sure. It depends on what this statue originally had in his hands. If it had a trident, then it was Poseidon. If it had a bolt of lightning, then it was Zeus. Either way, absolutely perfect. Anatomically, it's perfect. Of course, it's a god, so it's meant to be that way. But notice that the Greeks do their gods to look like perfect human beings. Um, uh, their gods are not like the Egyptians or the Mesopotamians. The balance of this bronze statue is amazing. You can pass a sheet of paper underneath the heel of one of his feet and under the front part of the other. The balance is staggeringly real, and again, balanced, symmetrical, no emotion, can stand there forever. Absolute perfection. And this is how the Greeks felt about themselves in that golden age of Pericles. But then, of course, there's the rest of the story.